The idea that the apple was the forbidden fruit consumed by Eve in the Garden of Eden is deeply rooted in Western culture, but this image is actually a much later construction than the biblical accounts. In the Genesis narrative, there is no specific mention that the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was an apple. Despite this, the apple became, almost universally, the symbol of this biblical episode, especially in Christian art and literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But why then was the apple chosen as the symbol of original sin? The myth of the apple as the forbidden fruit solidified through a series of theological interpretations, biblical translations, and cultural representations that occurred long after the original text. The biblical narrative is intentionally ambiguous about the nature of the fruit, referring to it simply as fruit, without specific details. This allowed different traditions and cultures to imagine the forbidden fruit in various ways, until the apple became the dominant symbol. One of the most important factors contributing to this association was the linguistic and cultural context of Latin. During the period of the Bible's translation into Latin, a linguistic confusion involving the word malum, which means both apple and evil, or curse, created a link between the apple and sin. This etymological coincidence may have been one of the main reasons why the apple came to be seen as the forbidden fruit, especially in Western tradition. Over the centuries, this interpretation was solidified through Christian art and literature. Works like John Milton's Paradise Lost further reinforced this idea, making the apple the icon of temptation and the fall of humanity. The representation of the apple is not just a visual convention, but also carries a profound symbolism of desire, temptation, and transgression, which reflected well the theological and cultural concerns of the medieval and Renaissance periods. The apple, in short, became more than just a fruit. It became a powerful emblem of human weakness and the separation from the divine. In the Genesis account, which describes the fall of Adam and Eve, the Bible is quite vague about the identity of the forbidden fruit. In Genesis 3, the text refers only to the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, without mentioning a specific type of fruit. The ambiguity seems intentional, leaving the interpretation open to various possibilities. What matters, however, is not so much the type of fruit, but the disobedience to the divine command, which caused the fall of humanity and brought sin and death into the world. The lack of specific details about the fruit in the original narrative can be seen as a deliberate choice, perhaps to emphasize the story's symbolism rather than material details. The Hebrew text of Genesis uses the word peri to describe the fruit, a generic term that can apply to virtually any type of edible fruit. This generality left room for different cultures over the centuries to speculate on the nature of the forbidden fruit, from figs to pomegranates, without a definitive answer. Beyond the fruit itself, another interesting detail is the use of fig leaves to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness after eating the fruit. This has led many scholars and theologians throughout history to speculate that the forbidden fruit could have been a fig. The choice of the fig tree as the source of humanity's first clothing can be seen as a symbolic clue left in the text, suggesting a possible link between the tree of knowledge and the fig tree. However, the biblical text never makes this connection explicitly, leaving the question open. What is clear, however, is that the ambiguity of the biblical text opened the door to varied cultural and artistic interpretations over the centuries. Different religious traditions, from Judaism to Christianity and Islam, have offered their own interpretations of what the forbidden fruit might have been, leading to a rich diversity of representations, each with its own symbolism and theological implications. But the Bible itself remains purposefully vague about the type of fruit, emphasizing the sin of disobedience above all else. The confusion that linked the apple to the forbidden fruit likely began with the Bible's translation into Latin. In the 4th century, Pope Damasus III commissioned St. Jerome to translate the Hebrew and Greek scriptures into Latin, creating what we know today as the Vulgate. Latin was the dominant language of the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, and Jerome's translation became the standard for Western Christianity for many centuries. It was during this translation process that a wordplay linked the apple to original sin. In Latin, the word malum has a double meaning. Depending on the context, malum can refer to the noun apple or to the adjective evil or curse. The original Hebrew uses the word peri, which is a generic term for any type of fruit. However, when translated into Latin, Jerome's choice of malus as the translation may have been influenced by the semantic ambiguity of the term. Thus, the forbidden fruit came to be interpreted as an apple, especially due to the association with the concept of evil. This linguistic ambiguity became solidified over time, making the apple the almost universal symbol of the forbidden fruit. In the cultural context of medieval Europe, this association found fertile ground to flourish, as Latin was the liturgical language of the Catholic Church. The coincidence of malum, meaning both apple and evil, seemed to fit perfectly into the narrative of the fall of Adam and Eve, creating a deep symbolic connection between the fruit and sin. The apple, being seen as the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, also became the symbol of sin and disobedience. Another interesting aspect of this association is the fact that, at the time the Vulgate was written, knowledge of different types of fruits was much more limited than it is today. Fruits like pomegranates, figs, or wheat, which were common in Palestine and biblical regions, were not as common in Western Europe. The apple, on the other hand, was a widely cultivated and well-known fruit. Therefore, it was natural for Western Europeans to visualize the forbidden fruit as something familiar, further contributing to the perpetuation of this idea. This Latin wordplay was not the only reason for the association of the apple with the forbidden fruit, but it was undoubtedly an important catalyst for Christian iconography and theological interpretation in the West. Over the centuries, the linguistic confusion between the term malum, apple, and malum, evil, became a powerful symbol in Christian art and culture, solidifying the image of the apple as the forbidden fruit consumed by Eve in the Garden of Eden. Before the apple became consolidated as the forbidden fruit in Western Christianity, several alternative interpretations about the type of fruit that caused the fall of Adam and Eve already existed, especially among early Jewish and Christian scholars. In rabbinic texts, such as the Midrash and the Talmud, there are debates and speculations about what this fruit might have been. Among the most popular interpretations is the fig, due to the fact that Adam and Eve covered their nakedness with fig leaves immediately after eating the fruit. This choice is considered a symbolic clue that the fig might have been the forbidden fruit. Another common interpretation, especially in Jewish traditions, is that the fruit might have been a pomegranate. The pomegranate has rich symbolism in many ancient cultures, often associated with fertility, abundance, and knowledge. The pomegranate also appears in other religious and mythological texts, such as the Greek myth of Persephone, where consuming the fruit ties her to the underworld and mortality. In Jewish tradition, the pomegranate is a symbol of justice, as it is believed to contain 613 seeds, corresponding to the 613 commandments of the Torah. Thus, some rabbis suggest that the pomegranate, with its strong spiritual symbolism, could have been the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Other interpretations identify the fruit as a grape, especially because of the connection between grapes and wine, which also carries strong spiritual and symbolic meaning. Grapes are associated with joy and celebration in many biblical traditions, but wine, on the other hand, also has connotations of drunkenness and loss of control. Thus, some theologians interpret the fruit as grapes or wine, symbolizing the loss of innocence and the knowledge that distorts one's perception of reality. This view of the fruit as a source of spiritual intoxication appears in some rabbinic and esoteric texts, suggesting that the fall was caused by a type of intoxication of knowledge. A less common, but still intriguing view suggests that the forbidden fruit was not actually a fruit as we know it, but rather wheat. Wheat was an essential food in the ancient world, and some rabbinic traditions suggest that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was actually a form of cereal. According to this interpretation, eating the wheat represented humanity's transition to cultivating and manipulating nature more deeply, symbolizing practical knowledge and the ability to transform the world around them. Although this view is less popular, it adds a layer of complexity to the symbolism of the forbidden fruit, relating it directly to humanity's ability to transform and even distort divine creation. The medieval and Renaissance periods were crucial for consolidating the image of the apple as the forbidden fruit. The Catholic Church, with its dominant influence on cultural and spiritual life in Europe, profoundly shaped Christian iconography. During this period, sacred art aimed to educate the population, most of whom were illiterate. Artistic representations of the fall of Adam and Eve were intended to convey the moral lessons of the Bible in an accessible way, and the choice of the apple as a symbol of original sin was reinforced in this visual context. One of the most iconic works to associate the apple with the Garden of Eden is Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which depicts Adam and Eve beside the tree of knowledge, surrounded by a serpent. Although Michelangelo did not limit himself to the representation of the apple, he used fig leaves to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness. The fact that Renaissance art often portrayed biblical scenes with easily recognizable fruits, such as apples, helped perpetuate this image. Besides Michelangelo, other great masters of the Renaissance, such as Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach, also depicted the fall of man with the apple as the forbidden fruit. Another factor contributing to the choice of the apple in artistic representations was its shape and color. The apple, with its smooth, round, and red appearance, was ideal for symbolizing sin. Red was often associated with desire and sin in medieval and Renaissance art, directly connecting the fruit's color to carnal temptation and disobedience. The shape of the apple, in turn, represented perfection and the seduction of something seemingly harmless, but carrying devastating consequences. This combination of shape and color, along with religious symbolism, transformed the apple into the ideal visual icon to represent the forbidden fruit. While many artists of the medieval and Renaissance periods chose the apple for their representations, not all agreed with this choice. In fact, there was a diversity of visual interpretations of the forbidden fruit. The Ghent altarpiece, for example, depicts the fruit as a lemon, while other artists, such as Rubens, used the pomegranate. However, as the centuries passed, the representation of the apple became predominant in the popular imagination. John Milton's literary work, Paradise Lost, also played a significant role by describing the apple as the forbidden fruit, helping to consolidate this image in both literature and art. The symbolism of the apple in Western culture goes far beyond its representation as the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Throughout history, the apple has been associated with various layers of meaning, from temptation and sin to fertility, desire, and wisdom. In the specific case of Adam and Eve's narrative, the apple represents the loss of innocence and the transgression of divine order, a symbol of human curiosity that leads to disobedience and ultimately, the fall. But the apple carries varied symbolism in other cultures and mythologies, which helped reinforce its connection to the biblical narrative. In Greek mythology, for example, the apple is a frequent symbol. The most famous is the golden apple of the Garden of the Hesperides, offered by Paris to the goddess Aphrodite in exchange for the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy. This episode, known as the Judgment of Paris, led to the Trojan War, highlighting the apple as a symbol of desire and conflict. Additionally, apples were also associated with Hera, the goddess of marriage and fertility, symbolizing the power of choice and the consequences of decisions. This connection with desire and seduction was inherited by Christian representations, which associated the apple with sin and temptation in the Garden of Eden. In the context of Christianity, the apple also carries symbolic weight related to sexuality and fertility. The round shape of the fruit is often associated with fullness and life, while its sweetness evokes the idea of pleasure and temptation. However, this sweetness turns to bitterness when the fruit is consumed against God's will, bringing about humanity's fall. In many works of art and literature, the apple symbolizes the duality of human desire, the pursuit of immediate pleasure that results in devastating spiritual and moral consequences. The symbolism of the apple, as a combination of desire and punishment, resonated strongly in Western culture, especially during periods of strong religious influence, such as the Middle Ages. Another relevant aspect of the apple's symbolism is its connection to fertility. The fruit, with its multiple seeds, was often seen as a symbol of fertility and abundance. However, in the narrative of Adam and Eve, this fertility is inverted. By eating the forbidden fruit, they not only lose their innocence, but also gain mortality and the suffering of earthly life. The idea that something seemingly fertile and good can, in fact, carry the curse of pain and death is a central theme in the iconography of the apple in Christian tradition. This symbolism, as mentioned, was reinforced by John Milton in Paradise Lost, who vividly described the apple with sensory detail, contributing to its consolidation as the ultimate symbol of temptation and the fall in the Christian imagination. Although the debate about the exact type of fruit consumed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden has sparked speculation over the centuries, the true importance of this story is far from limited to the identity of the fruit. The central focus of the biblical narrative in Genesis is not on the fruit itself, but on the act of disobedience that led to humanity's fall. The fruit, whether it be an apple, fig, pomegranate, or any other fruit, serves as a symbol of humanity's choice to disobey God and seek knowledge on its own, rather than trusting in divine guidance. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents the dividing line between innocence and moral awareness. Before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve lived in harmony with God, unaware of sin and shame. By choosing to disobey and eat the fruit, their eyes were opened to a new reality, that of good and evil, guilt and responsibility. This knowledge brought with it the separation between them and God, as well as the spiritual and physical consequences that humanity has faced ever since: mortality, suffering, and the constant struggle against sin. From a theological point of view, the fruit from the Garden of Eden symbolizes the complexity of human freedom. God gave Adam and Eve the ability to choose, and they chose disobedience. This act of choice is not limited to what they ate, but to the act of trusting or not trusting God's word. The fruit, therefore, is merely the means through which this choice manifested. The story highlights the tension between human free will and obedience to God, a question that echoes throughout the rest of Scripture and Christian theology. Ultimately, when reflecting on the story of the forbidden fruit, it is important to remember that its meaning transcends the identification of a specific fruit. The Genesis narrative offers a profound explanation for the human condition, addressing issues of morality, temptation, guilt, and redemption. Whether it was an apple or any other fruit, what truly matters is the spiritual lesson that, by disobeying God, humanity broke its direct relationship with the Creator. The story reminds us of the consequences of sin, but also of the hope for redemption, a theme developed throughout the Bible, culminating in the coming of Christ as the Redeemer of humanity. While the Genesis text focuses on human disobedience and its consequences, the symbolism of the forbidden fruit goes beyond mere transgression. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with its fruit, symbolizes a form of wisdom that was not meant for humanity in its original state. By eating the fruit, Adam and Eve not only defied a direct order from God, but also took something that was exclusive to the divine: absolute moral discernment. This knowledge, previously belonging only to God, brought with it a new perception of the world, but also the human inability to fully deal with the consequences of such power. The story shows that although knowledge is valuable, it can also be dangerous when sought outside the limits of the divine plan. Adam and Eve's action marks the first transgression, and the image of their eyes being opened after consuming the fruit is laden with implications. The opening of the eyes symbolizes the loss of innocence and the awareness of the human condition, a painful revelation, as the knowledge of good and evil implies the capacity for judgment, guilt, and repentance. Furthermore, this new awareness is tied to mortality. From the moment they ate the fruit, the concept of physical and spiritual death entered the equation of human life. This marks the end of immortality and the introduction of suffering into the world, something God directly mentions as part of the consequence of original sin. Another interesting aspect the story of the fruit raises is the idea that knowledge itself is not inherently evil. The tree was of the knowledge of good and evil, not just evil. This suggests that wisdom and moral discernment are important gifts, but must be acquired in the right way. Adam and Eve's fall, then, was not simply due to the desire for knowledge, but to seeking that knowledge improperly, disregarding the boundaries set by God. Here, the narrative suggests an eternal tension: humanity's thirst to know more about the universe we live in and about ourselves, and the need to submit that pursuit to divine will, acknowledging that there is a right time and a proper way to acquire wisdom. The fruit, whatever it was, is a representation of the conflict between human autonomy and trust in God's sovereignty. This dilemma continues to be a fundamental issue in spirituality and morality throughout human history. To this day, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden challenges us to reflect on the choices we make and the reasons behind them. Are we seeking knowledge and power for the right reasons? Or are we constantly repeating the original mistake, trying to take for ourselves something that ultimately belongs to God? The forbidden fruit, more than a symbol of punishment, is a profound reminder of our responsibility to understand and respect divine limits.